What if everything you believe about the world came from choices made by people long dead? People who never imagined you would exist. Every border you see, every law you follow, every conflict you hear about is not random. It is the result of fear, ambition, hope, and human mistakes repeated across thousands of years. History is not a dusty subject locked in textbooks. It is a living force shaping your life right now. Miss this story, and you miss why the world is broken and how it could still be healed. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. The history of the world is not a straight line marching toward progress, nor a single story told by kings and conquerors. It is a fragile, unfinished conversation between hope and fear, courage and cruelty, memory and forgetting. It begins not with empires, but with people. Small bands of humans huddled around fires, staring into the darkness, wondering whether tomorrow would bring food, danger, or one more sunrise. From those early moments, everything that followed, every nation, every war, every idea, grew out of the same simple human desires: to survive, to belong, and to matter. As centuries passed, humans learned to shape the earth and, just as importantly, to shape one another. Cities rose from riverbanks, laws emerged to restrain chaos, and stories were written to explain the unexplainable. Civilization brought beauty, art, language, philosophy, but it also carried shadows. Power concentrated, hierarchies hardened, and the line between leadership and domination blurred. Again and again, history shows us the same truth. When people believe they are chosen, superior, or entitled, suffering soon follows. Empires came proclaiming order and destiny. They built roads, temples, and monuments meant to last forever. Yet every empire eventually discovered the same humbling lesson: that force can conquer land, but not time. Rome fell, dynasties collapsed, flags were lowered. What endured were not the crowns, but the ideas. Ideas about justice, faith, reason, and human dignity that survived long after the stones crumbled. The world story is also a story of resistance. Enslaved people who refused to believe they were property, women who challenged the limits placed upon their voices, thinkers who dared to say that authority must answer to the governed. Time and again, ordinary individuals, often unnamed, stood against accepted cruelty and quietly bent the arc of history. They remind us that progress is never guaranteed, but it is always possible. The modern age brought astonishing power. Science unlocked nature's secrets, machines shrank the planet, information began to travel faster than wisdom. The same century that cured diseases also perfected mass destruction. The same tools that connected humanity also divided it. The world learned at unbearable cost that intelligence without empathy can be deadly, and that moral courage matters as much as innovation. And now here we stand, heirs to every triumph and every failure that came before. We live with the accumulated consequences of centuries of choices. History is not behind us, it is within us. It lives in our borders, our beliefs, our fears, and our hopes. It asks us, quietly but insistently, whether we have learned anything at all. The history of the world does not tell us who we must be, but it warns us who we become when we forget our shared humanity. It reminds us that the future is not shaped by destiny alone, but by decisions made in moments of doubt and courage. In the end, history is not merely the record of what happened. It is a mirror, asking each generation the same enduring question: what will you choose to do with the world you have been given? History is a human story driven by fear, hope, and choice, long before it became dates in books or monuments in stone. At its core, history begins inside the human mind in moments when people faced uncertainty and had to decide how to respond. Fear was often the first companion: fear of hunger, fear of the unknown, fear of the other. Early humans looked at storms, wild animals, darkness, and death with trembling questions. They did not know the laws of nature, but they knew vulnerability. That fear pushed them to gather together, to create families and tribes, to invent tools and rituals. Fear did not only paralyze, it motivated survival, cooperation, and adaptation. Without fear, there might have been no urgency to build shelter, no reason to protect one another, no instinct to prepare for tomorrow. Alongside fear, hope quietly emerged. Hope is what allowed humans to imagine a future different from the present. It was hope that whispered that the next season might be kinder, that the harvest could be better, that life could be more than mere survival. Hope gave birth to stories, myths, and faiths. People looked at the sky and believed meaning existed beyond suffering. Hope turned caves into communities and wandering groups into settled societies. It inspired art on stone walls. Songs passed from one generation to the next. and dreams of harmony with God's nature or one another. Hope was fragile, but it was persistent, surviving even when circumstances were brutal. Between fear and hope stood choice. Choice is the engine of history. At every stage, humans were confronted with decisions that shaped not only their lives, but the lives of those who followed. When people learned to farm, they chose stability over movement. When they formed governments, they chose rules over chaos. When they crowned leaders, they chose trust, obedience, or surrender. These choices were never abstract. They were deeply personal, often made under pressure, often imperfect. A single decision to share food or hoard it, to welcome a stranger or attack, to forgive or seek revenge, echoed outward into families, villages, and eventually civilizations. As societies grew, fear transformed. It was no longer just fear of nature, but fear of other humans. Fear of losing power, fear of being conquered, fear of ideas that challenged authority. Leaders learned how powerful fear could be when used deliberately. It could unite people against a common enemy, justify violence, and silence dissent. History is filled with moments where fear was manipulated to control populations, turning neighbors into enemies and suspicion into policy. Yet even in those moments, hope did not vanish. It hid in quiet resistance, in whispered conversations, in the belief that injustice was not permanent. Hope often appeared in unexpected places. In times of oppression, hope survived in songs sung by enslaved people, in letters written by prisoners, in teachings passed secretly from parent to child. Hope did not always look like optimism. Sometimes it looked like endurance. The decision to wake up and continue living under harsh conditions was itself an act of hope. History shows that hope does not require certainty, only the belief that suffering is not the final word. Choice became more complex as the world expanded. With greater knowledge came greater responsibility. The invention of writing allowed humans to record laws, stories, and power structures, turning personal choices into institutional ones. Decisions made by a few could now affect thousands, then millions. Empires rose because people chose conquest over coexistence, expansion over restraint. These choices were often fueled by fear of scarcity, fear of rivals, and justified by hope of glory, prosperity, or divine favor. The results were mixed, remarkable achievements in engineering and culture, alongside immense suffering and loss. Throughout history, individuals faced moments where fear and hope pulled them in opposite directions. Some chose safety and silence. Others risked everything for change. Reformers, philosophers, and revolutionaries were rarely free from fear. They simply chose to act despite it. Their choices were not guaranteed to succeed, and many paid with exile, imprisonment, or death. Yet their willingness to choose hope over fear altered the moral landscape of the world. Ideas about freedom, equality, and human dignity emerged not because history was kind, but because people dared to imagine something better. Ordinary people, far from centers of power, also shaped history through daily choices. A farmer deciding how to treat workers, a parent choosing what values to teach a child, a citizen deciding whether to obey an unjust law. These moments rarely appear in textbooks, yet they form the fabric of historical change. Large events are built from countless small decisions repeated over time. Fear might have encouraged conformity, but hope sustained quiet defiance. Even periods labeled as progress reveal this tension. Scientific and technological advances were driven by hope for improvement, but they also created new fears. Machines promised abundance but threatened livelihoods. Discoveries cured diseases but introduced new ways to destroy. Each advancement forced humanity to choose how power would be used. History shows that tools themselves are neutral. It is human choice, shaped by fear or hope, that determines their impact. The modern world, with its speed and scale, magnified these forces. Information spread faster than reflection. Fear traveled instantly, amplified by rumor and rhetoric. Hope, too, found new channels, inspiring global movements for rights and justice. The same technologies that enabled surveillance and control also allowed voices once ignored to be heard. Again, the decisive factor was not invention alone, but how humans chose to respond to it. History, seen through this lens, is not inevitable. It is contingent, fragile, and profoundly human. It unfolds not because events must happen, but because people choose again and again how to act when faced with uncertainty. Fear narrows vision, pushing toward protection and dominance. Hope expands it, inviting empathy and imagination. Choice stands between them, demanding responsibility. Every generation inherits the accumulated results of past fears, hopes, and choices, and then adds its own layer, often without realizing the weight of what it carries. Power builds civilizations, but often sows their collapse because it is both a creative and a corrosive force within human societies. From the earliest settlements to the largest empires, power has been the tool through which order was imposed, resources were organized, and collective ambition was realized. Without power, cities could not have been built, armies could not have defended borders, and laws could not have been enforced. Power allowed humans to move beyond small, fragile communities and attempt something larger, something enduring. It gave structure to chaos and direction to shared effort, making civilization possible. In its early forms, power was often personal and immediate. Strength, wisdom, or charisma elevated certain individuals to leadership. These figures coordinated labor, settled disputes, and protected their people. When power functioned as responsibility, societies tended to thrive. The leader was seen as a guardian, and authority was tied to service, ritual, or tradition. Yet even in these early moments, the temptation to transform power into dominance was present. Once power was tasted, the desire to preserve it often replaced the duty to use it wisely. As populations grew and societies became more complex, power detached from individuals and embedded itself in institutions. Kingship, priesthoods, bureaucracies, and armies emerged to manage growing territories. These systems enabled remarkable achievements. Roads connected distant regions, irrigation sustained agriculture, and written laws created a sense of order across vast lands. Power centralized decision-making, allowing civilizations to act with speed and unity. At their height, empires appeared invincible, projecting strength through monuments, rituals, and military might. Yet the very concentration of power that allowed civilizations to rise also planted the seeds of instability. When authority accumulated in the hands of the few, distance grew between rulers and the ruled. Decisions were made far from the realities of ordinary life. Over time, power became less about stewardship and more about preservation of status. Leaders surrounded themselves with symbols of grandeur, mistaking obedience for loyalty and silence for stability. Dissent was no longer seen as a warning, but as a threat. History repeatedly shows how power reshapes human behavior. Those who hold it often begin to believe in their own necessity. Success convinces them that their rule is inevitable, even divinely sanctioned. Laws are bent to serve authority rather than justice. Institutions designed to protect society become tools to protect those in control. Fear replaces trust as the glue holding the system together. The energy once used to build now turns inward, focused on surveillance, repression, and the elimination of rival. Economic power follows a similar pattern. Wealth enables innovation, trade, and cultural flourishing. It funds art, education, and infrastructure. But when wealth concentrates excessively, it fractures societies. Inequality hardens into hierarchy. The labor of many sustains the luxury of a few. Over time, resentment grows and faith in the social order erodes. Empires that once promised opportunity come to symbolize exploitation. The gap between official narratives of greatness and lived reality becomes impossible to ignore. Military power, often the backbone of empires, carries its own contradictions. Armies defend borders and deter invasion, creating a sense of security. But reliance on force reshapes priorities. Resources flow toward conquest rather than care. Violence becomes normalized as a political solution. As military power expands, so does the belief that problems can be solved through domination. Eventually, wars meant to secure stability exhaust the very societies that wage them. Soldiers return broken, treasuries emptied, and moral authority diminished. Cultural power can be equally double-edged. Shared beliefs, values, and identities bind people together. They create meaning and cohesion. Civilizations often flourish when they offer compelling stories about who they are and why they matter. Yet when cultural power becomes rigid, it resists change. Traditions turn into dogma. New ideas are dismissed as dangerous. Innovation slows and societies struggle to adapt to changing realities. The refusal to question inherited assumptions leaves civilizations vulnerable to both internal decay and external challenge. The collapse of civilizations rarely comes from a single blow. More often, it is the cumulative result of power misused over time. Corruption seeps into institutions. Leaders prioritize short-term advantage over long-term stability. Systems grow, complex, but inflexible. When crises arise, Economic collapse, environmental stress, invasion. The structures built on unchecked power prove brittle. What once appeared strong reveals hidden weaknesses. History also reveals that collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it unfolds quietly. Roads fall into disrepair, public trust fades, laws lose legitimacy, people withdraw their loyalty, not in rebellion, but in resignation. The center no longer holds because power no longer serves a shared purpose. In such moments, civilizations may continue in name, but their spirit has already diminished. Even societies that learn from past failures struggle to escape this cycle. Each generation inherits institutions shaped by previous concentrations of power. Reform is possible, but it requires those in authority to limit themselves, a task history suggests is profoundly difficult. Power resists restraint. It seeks expansion, justification, permanence. When unchecked, it creates the conditions for its own undoing by silencing the feedback that could correct it. Yet the story is not simply one of inevitability. History offers moments when power was reimagined rather than destroyed, when authority was redistributed, when accountability was strengthened, when leaders recognized that legitimacy depends on consent and trust. These moments are rare and fragile, often contested, but they demonstrate that power does not have to end in collapse. It can be renewed through humility, shared responsibility, and moral restraint. Still, the tension remains. Power builds because humans need order, coordination, and leadership. Power destroys when it forgets why it was created in the first place. Civilizations rise on the promise that power will serve the common good, and they fall when that promise is broken, when strength replaces wisdom, when control replaces care, when survival of the system becomes more important than the lives within it. Ideas endure longer than empires because they are carried not by stone or armies, but by human minds and hearts, moving quietly across generations, borders, and ruins. Empires depend on territory, force, and obedience, all of which are vulnerable to time, resistance, and decay. Ideas, by contrast, are adaptable. They change form without losing essence, surviving conquest, exile, and suppression. When cities burn and banners fall, ideas slip through the cracks of history, carried in memory, language, and belief. From the earliest civilizations, rulers understood this distinction, even if they could not fully control it. They built monuments to proclaim permanence. Yet those monuments now stand as evidence of impermanence. The ideas that animated those societies often outlived the structures meant to preserve them. Concepts of law, governance, morality, and meaning migrated from one civilization to another, reshaped by new contexts. The empire that first articulated an idea rarely owned it for long. Religious ideas offer some of the clearest examples. Kingdoms that rose and fell around sacred traditions are gone, but the beliefs themselves continue to shape lives centuries later. Faith traveled along trade routes, through exile and persecution, often growing stronger when power attempted to crush it. The endurance of belief demonstrates that ideas do not require political dominance to survive. In many cases, loss of power freed ideas from compromise, allowing them to speak more directly to human longing and fear. Philosophical ideas followed a similar path. Questions about justice, truth, and the nature of reality were posed in small city-states, academies, and marketplaces. The institutions that hosted these conversations disappeared, yet the questions remained. Thinkers wrote for their own time, but their words reach far beyond it. Later generations found in these ideas tools to challenge authority, reimagine society, or make sense of suffering. An empire could ban a book, but it could not erase the hunger that made people seek its wisdom. Political ideas, perhaps more than any other, reveal the contrast between endurance and collapse. Empires often governed through hierarchy and command, yet ideas about representation, rights, and consent emerged at the margins or in moments of crisis. These ideas were fragile at first, frequently defeated by force, but defeat did not mean disappearance. Each time they resurfaced, they carried the memory of previous failures, becoming sharper and more resilient. Long after the empires that suppressed them were gone, these ideas continued to inspire movements and revolutions. Language itself is an idea that outlives empire. The tongues imposed by conquerors often survived their rule, transformed into shared tools of communication. Words absorbed local meaning, carrying traces of past dominance while enabling new forms of expression. Through language, stories were preserved, grievances remembered, and identities sustained. Even when empires attempted to erase cultures, language provided a quiet form of resistance, a way to pass down memory when official. History denied it. Art and literature further demonstrate how ideas endure. Empires funded grand works to glorify themselves, yet artists often embedded deeper truths within those creations. Long after the political context faded, the emotional and philosophical content remained accessible. A poem written under tyranny could speak to later generations facing different forms of constraint. A painting commissioned by power might outlast that power by revealing universal human experiences rather than political triumph. Education became one of the most powerful vehicles for the survival of ideas. Teachers, scribes, and scholars preserved knowledge through copying, commentary, and translation. In times of collapse, learning often retreated into monasteries, homes, or informal networks. These fragile chains of transmission were easily broken, yet remarkably resilient. Each person who chose to teach, to remember, to pass something on, extended the life of an idea beyond the lifespan of any state. Empires frequently attempted to claim ownership of ideas, presenting them as evidence of their greatness. Yet once an idea enters the world, it becomes impossible to contain. Others reinterpret it, challenge it, adapt it to new realities. Ideas thrive on disagreement. Unlike empires, which seek stability, ideas evolve through tension and debate. This capacity for change is what allows them to endure. An idea that cannot adapt eventually becomes irrelevant, but one that invites reinterpretation can survive across centuries. The endurance of ideas also exposes the limits of power. Force can compel behavior, but it cannot command belief. Empires discovered that while they could enforce laws, they could not fully control how people understood justice. They could demand loyalty, but not genuine conviction. When official ideology clashed too sharply with lived experience, people quietly turned elsewhere for meaning. In these private spaces, ideas incubated, waiting for moments when they could surface openly. History shows that the most enduring ideas often emerge during periods of instability. Times of collapse strip away illusions of permanence, forcing people to confront fundamental questions. What is worth preserving? What defines a good life? What obligations humans owe one another? In answering these questions, societies generate ideas that speak not just to their own crisis, but to universal conditions. These ideas survive because they address enduring human concerns, rather than temporary political arrangements. The transmission of ideas across cultures further strengthens their longevity. An idea born in one place is often refined elsewhere. Trade, migration, and conquest all facilitated this exchange, sometimes unintentionally. Empires moved people and goods, but ideas moved independently, reshaped by those who encountered them. Each adaptation added layers of meaning, increasing relevance rather than diluting it. Memory plays a crucial role in this endurance. Collective memory selects what to carry forward, often favoring ideas that resonate emotionally or morally. Even when official histories are rewritten, alternative memories persist in families, communities, and traditions. These memories preserve ideas that challenge dominant narratives, ensuring that collapse does not equal erasure. In the end, the ruins of empires stand as reminders of ambition, achievement, and failure. Yet it is the invisible inheritance of ideas that continues to shape the world. They guide how societies define justice, authority, and human worth. They inform choices long after their origins are forgotten. Empires demand loyalty in the present, but ideas speak to the future, waiting patiently for minds willing to receive them. Progress is born from resistance and moral courage, not from comfort or inevitability, but from moments when individuals and communities decide that the world as it is cannot remain the world as it should be. Resistance begins with awareness, with the recognition that suffering is not natural law and that injustice is not destiny. Throughout history, progress has rarely emerged from those most secure within existing systems. It has come instead from those who felt the weight of exclusion, cruelty, or silence, and who refused to accept those conditions as permanent. Resistance does not always announce itself loudly. Often it begins as an inner conflict, a private reckoning between fear and conscience. A person realizes that obedience carries its own cost, that silence can become a form of participation. Moral courage is forged in these moments when the risk of speaking or acting is weighed against the damage of doing nothing. History remembers the visible acts of defiance, but behind each of them lies a long process of doubt, hesitation, and resolve. The earliest forms of resistance appeared wherever power demanded submission without justice. In ancient societies, peasants resisted through flight, refusal, or quiet non-compliance. Slaves preserved identity through language, ritual, and memory. These acts did not overthrow systems overnight, but they prevented total domination. Resistance kept alive the idea that authority could be questioned, that control was never absolute. Progress often begins not with victory, but with survival. As moral frameworks developed, resistance gained language. Religious and philosophical traditions introduced concepts of higher law, conscience, and human worth. These ideas gave people tools to challenge earthly power without rejecting order itself. To resist was no longer merely to oppose force, but to appeal to values that transcended it. Moral courage, in this sense, was not rebellion for its own sake, but fidelity to principles believed to be universal. History shows that those who resist are often labeled dangerous, disruptive, or ungrateful. Power rarely recognizes moral courage in real time. Reformers are accused of threatening stability, even when stability is built on suffering. This pattern repeats across centuries. Those who challenge injustice are told to wait, to be patient, to accept gradual change. Yet progress has rarely followed the schedule of those who benefit from delay. Moments of significant change are often triggered by individuals who refuse to wait. Their actions expose contradictions within the system, forcing societies to confront what they claim to value versus what they tolerate. Moral courage is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of innocence. It demands that others choose sides, that they acknowledge complicity or commitment. Resistance unsettles because it asks questions that cannot be easily dismissed. Collective resistance magnifies this effect. When individual acts of courage converge into movements, progress becomes possible. These movements are rarely unified or pure. They contain disagreements, failures, and unintended consequences, yet they create pressure that institutions cannot ignore. Laws change not because power becomes generous, but because resistance makes injustice more costly than reform. Moral courage shifts the balance. Violence is often used to suppress resistance, revealing how fragile unjust systems truly are. The willingness to harm in order to preserve power exposes its moral bankruptcy. History remembers these moments not for the strength of the oppressors, but for the courage of those who endured punishment without surrendering their convictions. Progress is measured not only in victories, but in the willingness to pay a price for principle. Resistance also reshapes identity. Those who act with moral courage redefine what it means to belong to a society. They expand the boundaries of who is considered worthy of rights, dignity, and protection. Progress is not simply the addition of new laws, but the transformation of collective imagination. Once people can imagine a more just order, the old one begins to lose legitimacy. Education plays a critical role in this process. Knowledge empowers resistance by revealing alternatives. Learning history exposes patterns of domination and struggle, reminding each generation that change has occurred before. Our courage draws strength from memory. Knowing that others have faced similar risks and persisted makes resistance feel less isolated, less impossible. Yet resistance is never without cost. Those who challenge injustice often face isolation, loss, and failure. Progress does not guarantee recognition or reward. Many who acted with moral courage did not live to see the results of their efforts. Their significance lies not in personal success, but in the space they opened for others. Progress accumulates through sacrifice, layered across time. There is also the danger of romanticizing resistance. Not all opposition leads to progress. Moral courage requires discernment as well as bravery. History contains examples where resistance hardened into extremism, replacing one form of injustice with another. True moral courage remains accountable to the values it claims to defend. It resists dehumanization even when confronting cruelty. Progress falters when resistance abandons empathy. The tension between order and justice defines much of human history. Order promises security, predictability, and peace. Justice demands fairness, dignity, and inclusion. When these two come into conflict, resistance emerges as the force that attempts to realign them. Moral courage insists that peace without justice is fragile, that stability built on exclusion cannot last. In modern times, resistance has taken new forms. Technology amplifies voices once silenced, but it also introduces new risks. Moral courage now includes the decision to speak truth in environments flooded with misinformation and hostility. The principles remain unchanged, even as the methods evolve. Progress still depends on individuals willing to stand against prevailing currents. Resistance is not only oppositional, it is creative. It imagines alternatives, builds parallel systems, and models new ways of living. Progress is sustained not just by tearing down what is unjust, but by demonstrating what could replace it. Moral courage includes the patience to build, not only the fire to confront. History suggests that progress is uneven, fragile, and reversible. Gains achieved through resistance can be eroded when moral courage fades. Each generation must rediscover the reasons behind hard-won changes. Resistance is not a single chapter, but a recurring responsibility. Moral courage must be renewed as circumstances change and new forms of injustice emerge. At its core, progress reflects a belief that human beings are capable of learning, of expanding compassion, of correcting past wrongs. Resistance is the mechanism through which this belief is tested. Moral courage transforms abstract values into lived reality, insisting that ideals matter most when they are inconvenient, when they carry risk, when they demand action rather than agreement. Each generation shapes the future through its decisions, whether consciously or by default, whether through bold action or quiet neglect. No generation begins with a blank slate. People are born into worlds already structured by earlier choices, borders drawn, systems built, injustices normalized, hopes partially fulfilled. Yet inheritance does not equal destiny. What defines a generation is not only what it receives, but what it chooses to do with that inheritance. History moves forward not simply because time passes, but because people respond to the circumstances they are given. Decisions are often misunderstood as dramatic turning points made by famous leaders. In reality, most decisions that shape the future are ordinary, repeated, and cumulative. They are embedded in daily life. What is tolerated, what is challenged, what is ignored. When a generation accepts certain conditions as inevitable, it quietly extends their lifespan. When it questions them, even tentatively, it introduces the possibility of change. The future is formed less by singular moments than by patterns of choice sustained over time. Every generation faces constraints that limit imagination. Economic pressures, cultural norms, and inherited fears narrow the range of what seems possible. People learn early which ideas are rewarded and which are punished. Decisions are made within these boundaries, often unconsciously. Yet history shows that boundaries shift when enough individuals push against them. What once seemed unthinkable becomes debatable, then acceptable, then expected. These shifts begin with decisions that feel small at the time. Responsibility across generations is unevenly distributed. Some inherit privilege and security, others inherit hardship and exclusion. Yet both are shaping forces. Those with power shape the future through action, while those without shape it through endurance, adaptation, and resistance. Silence from the powerful is itself a decision, as consequential as any policy. Endurance among the marginalized preserves the possibility of future transformation. Both leave marks on what follows. The decisions of one generation often create unintended consequences for the next. Innovations solve immediate problems but introduce new ones. Political compromises stabilize societies temporarily while postponing deeper conflicts. Environmental exploitation delivers prosperity while depleting resources. Each generation tends to overestimate the permanence of its solutions and underestimate the reach of its mistakes. The future becomes the place where these miscalculations are confronted. Memory plays a decisive role in shaping generational choices. What a generation remembers influences what it fears and what it values. Selective memory can sanitize the past, turning complex struggles into comforting myths. Honest memory, by contrast, exposes costs as well as achievements. When generations choose to forget injustice, they risk repeating it. When they remember only failure, they may become paralyzed. The balance between pride and humility determines whether memory becomes a guide or a burden. Education is one of the most powerful decision-making tools passed between generations. What is taught, how it is taught, and whose stories are included shape the moral imagination of the future. A generation that teaches obedience over inquiry prepares its successors for control rather than creativity. One that encourages critical thought invites challenge and renewal. These educational choices often appear neutral, yet their long-term effects are profound. Technological decisions illustrate this generational dynamic clearly. Each generation inherits tools it did not invent and adapts them in ways their creators could not predict. Decisions about how technology is used, whether to connect or exploit, to inform or manipulate, shape social norms. Once established, these norms become the starting point for the next generation, which must decide whether to accept or resist them. Moral responsibility across generations is often contested. People ask whether they should be held accountable for past injustices they did not personally commit. History suggests that responsibility is less about guilt than about response. A generation cannot change what came before, but it can decide whether to benefit from injustice without question or to address its consequences. The future is shaped by whether people see inherited problems as someone else's fault or as their own challenge. Crises accelerate generational decision-making. Wars, economic collapses, pandemics, and environmental disasters compress time, forcing choices that might otherwise be postponed. In these moments, values are revealed. Decisions made under pressure expose priorities that were previously abstract. Some generations respond to crisis by retreating into fear and exclusion. Others expand definitions of solidarity and responsibility. The direction taken often defines the moral legacy of that era. Youth plays a unique role in this process. Younger generations encounter the world with fewer assumptions about permanence. What older generations see as fixed, younger ones often see as negotiable. Their decisions are shaped by both impatience and idealism. While experience tempers ambition, it can also constrain vision. The tension between generations becomes a source of renewal when it leads to dialogue rather than dismissal. At the same time, older generations shape the future through mentorship, example, and restraint. Decisions about what power to relinquish, what knowledge to pass on, and when to listen determine whether generational transition is destructive or constructive. Societies stagnate when authority clings too tightly to the present, fearing loss more than irrelevance. They decay when wisdom refuses to evolve. Economic choices made by one generation often define the opportunities available to the next. Investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and education expands future possibility. Neglect narrows it. Short-term gain frequently competes with long-term stability. When generations choose immediate comfort over sustainability, they shift burdens forward. The future becomes more constrained, more fragile, shaped by decisions made by those who will not live to face their consequences. Cultural values are similarly transmitted. Attitudes toward work, family, author, and difference are absorbed long before they are questioned. Each generation decides which values to preserve and which to discard. Change does not require rejection of the past, but reinterpretation. Traditions that survive do so because they adapt, not because they remain untouched. History reveals that the future is rarely shaped by unanimous agreement. It is shaped by those who act while others hesitate. This does not mean that decisiveness is always virtuous. Rash decisions can cause lasting harm, yet avoidance carries its own cost. When a generation delays difficult choices, it often passes them on in more severe form. The future inherits not only what was decided, but what was deferred. The cumulative weight of generational decisions creates momentum. Certain paths become easier to follow than to abandon. Systems entrench themselves. Reversing direction requires more effort than maintaining course. This is why early decisions matter disproportionately. What seems flexible in one moment hardens in the next. The future solidifies around choices that were once provisional. Each generation believes itself to be unique, facing unprecedented challenges. In some ways, this is true, yet history suggests a recurring pattern. New circumstances revive old questions: how to balance freedom and security, growth and restraint, individual ambition and collective responsibility. The answers differ, but the act of choosing remains constant. The future is shaped not by certainty, but by willingness to decide in the absence of it. Generational identity is formed through shared experience, but it is expressed through shared action. What binds a generation together is not age alone, but the decisions it makes when confronted with defining moments. These decisions leave traces that outlast personal lifespans, shaping institutions, landscapes, and norms. Ultimately, the futu. Re is not a distant abstraction waiting to arrive. It is being assembled continuously through choices made in the present. Each generation contributes pieces, some intentional, some accidental, to a structure it will never fully see. The responsibility lies not in predicting outcomes, but in recognizing that decisions made today will become the conditions others must live within, interpret, and respond to. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.